And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Diversity Speaks here with Ming McGlinden. It's an honor for her to be with us today and had a chance to look at her presentation briefly. And it's going to just hit home for a lot of us here when it comes to the space of disability and also of the intersection of technology, which we're in that age of technology. So I'm really excited to hear more about this information. So Ming Linden is a licensed and certified speech language pathologist with specialized expertise in augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. She has a wealth of experience working with children between the ages of 0 and 21 years old who demonstrate communication difficulties. Ming has worked for a number of years as a speech language pathologist and employs a variety of communication strategies to help children effectively convey messages with communication partners using various forms of assistive technology, which we're going to hear about today, which I'm excited about. Recognizing the vital role of communication in children's overall well being, Ming places a strong emphasis on respecting and celebrating cultural and linguistic diversity. She actively works to promote and nurture diverse perspectives while strengthening children's language development across different environments. Let's give Ming McGlinden a really great Diversity Speaks welcome and PHRC welcome. Welcome, Ming. So glad you're here with us
Thank
today.
you. Thank you so much, Anita. I'm happy to join everyone today. We're going to talk about breaking barriers through assistive technology or using assistive technology. My name is Ming McLinden. Anita just went over my biography. You may be familiar with me from Temple University, but I have since moved to Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Some of the learning objectives that I have for us today are to define systemic barriers and discrimination impacting people with disabilities in the realms of education, employment, and housing. I would like for us to define the role of assistive technology and identify how assistive technology can be used to overcome some systemic barriers that people with disabilities face. And I would like us to think about some strategies for access and inclusion, thinking about equitable access for people with disabilities and how they can navigate various systems using assistive technology. So to get us started, I just want to take a minute to think about the disability community and really understand that the disability community is pretty much one of the only marginalized groups that anyone can join at any point in time. If we're thinking about this, some people are born with disabilities, but others acquire disability perhaps through workplace accidents, maybe vehicular accidents on the road, and sometimes we just age into disabilities. The older we get, the more likely we are to encounter disabilities. Um, Going to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, some of the disability definitions that I want us to keep in mind today are just the fact that a disability is a physical or mental impairment that significantly limits one or more major life activities. The Americans with Disability Act also considers a person to have a disability if they have a history of having an impairment or if others perceive them as having an impairment. The CDC defines disability as a condition that impacts a person's mind or body and makes it difficult for them to complete certain activities and interact with the world around them. Taking some statistics from your community in Pennsylvania, in 2022, according to the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System data, about 28% of Pennsylvanians were considered disabled. The disabilities that were measured include mobility, cognition, independent living, hearing, vision, and self-care. The most prominent disability category or most prevalent disability category was cognitive disabilities in Pennsylvania at that time in 2022. There are a lot of health disparity increases for people with disability that we want to keep in mind. And we also want to keep in mind that disabilities are caused by different circumstances. Again, people can be born into a disability or they acquire it while living. To help us understand disability and access, I think it's really important to get a foundational understanding of the different models of disability. There are technically three models of disability. The third one that you do not see on the screen here is the functional model of disability, but I wanted to focus on the medical model and the social models of disability because they are in juxtaposition with each other. And the medical model says that the person themselves, there's something wrong with the disabled person, and that person needs to be fixed in order to fit in with society. The social model of disability says that there's nothing wrong with the person, but we need to alter the way things are in our environment, our communities, within our society, so that everyone, not just people with disabilities, but people with disabilities and people without disabilities can access the environment. And I want to bring up a quick story. A few weeks ago here in Virginia, I was talking to someone who works at the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind, and she was telling me this story about a little boy she'd met. And, they're going through the formalities of introductions. Oh, tell me about yourself, tell me about your family. And as the boy starts talking about his family, the woman asks him, oh, well, what's your sister's name? Tell me more about your sister. And he signs to her, oh, her name is Girl. And she's like, oh, but what's her name? And he's like, she's just Girl. So he's signing her as Girl. And while we're having this conversation, I was like, oh my goodness, he did not know his sister's name. And so thinking about that medical model of disability, the reason that he doesn't know his sister's name is because he has a hearing impairment, which means that his hearing needs to be fixed so that he can learn his sister's name. Under the social model, the reason that he doesn't know his sister's name is not because he has a hearing impairment itself, it's because no one in the family signed his sister's name for him to learn her name. And just with that story alone, I want us to keep in mind as we progress through this presentation that sometimes people who are not disabled are able to access information inherently just by existing within a space that people with disabilities do not get. So for the child with the hearing impairment, the reason that he did not know his sister's name was because no one sat down to sign his name. But for children without hearing impairments, typically we don't have to say, oh, this is your brother and his name is Jackson. Children learn their siblings' names just by being in a space and hearing people refer to this individual as their brother and hearing people refer to that individual as Jackson. So I wanted to share that story and keep that in mind as we progress through this presentation. We cannot really talk about accessibility and disability without acknowledging the intersectionality of everything that's at play. So typically, when we are able-bodied or just existing within that core, that power core in the center of the wheel that's on the screen, we don't or we may not experience many systemic barriers if we experience any systemic barriers. When we move out towards that outer marginalized core, we do experience or we may experience more systemic barriers. Um, Part of this is or the reason that this is important is because the more marginalized categories you fall into, the more likely you are to experience various systemic barriers due to the intersectionality of everything that we see on the screen. So ability, education, language. Um, are we able-bodied or are we not? And how does this impact our access to the environment around us? So thinking about disability, we're thinking about the social model of disability specifically. We're thinking about that intersectionality wheel, and we're looking at systemic barriers now. What are these systemic barriers? These are things that are structural or organizational obstacles that are written into policies, procedures, or understood within cultural norms that disadvantage specific groups of people. Systemic barriers can also exist within individuals according to their attitudes towards specific groups of people. Because today's presentation is focusing on employment, education, and housing, I wanted to give us some examples of systemic barriers in employment, education, and housing. So for employment, perhaps we have a hiring supervisor who makes presumptions about an applicant's ability to perform a job based on the visible disability that they see. And so they may not hire that individual. So that's a systemic barrier that someone with a disability would face in employment. When we're thinking about education, sometimes in the school setting, we see students who are suspended, whether it's in school suspension or out of school suspension, but they are suspended for behaviors that are directly linked to their disability, where maybe a student who has ADD as a disability is suspended for disrupting the class, right? So that's a behavior. They're engaging in a behavior and they are suspended for the behavior, but the behavior is directly linked to the student's disability. It's unfortunate because it does impact the student's education. When they're missing school, they're missing classroom material, curriculum material that is important for their education. And then when we're thinking about housing, people with disabilities may be treated differently from their non-disabled tenants. So maybe if we have an individual who has a cognitive impairment, their landlords may expect them to pay their rent a different way than people without disabilities are expected to pay their rent. So these are just some systemic barriers or examples of systemic barriers that I want us to keep in mind as we move through the presentation today. And I think the piece that will bring all of this together, these little foundational pieces, but the piece that'll bring all of this together is assistive technology, which is any device or service that is customized to meet someone's needs to help them access the environment around them. So an assistive technology device, for me as a speech language pathologist, I often think a lot about augmentative and alternative communication. So devices that are used to help people communicate. But the service would be me, the speech language pathologist, working with the person who requires the AAC device to communicate. So training them on how to use the device, training their support staff or their caregivers on how to edit the device and add additional vocabulary to the device so that the user can access the device for communication independently. Assistive technology does exist on a continuum from light tech to high tech. On the screen, we have different examples of augmentative and alternative communication. So to the far left, we have a light tech communication board. It does not have any traditional technology, not even a battery. It is just a board that a child with a with a communication impairment, they would point to pictures on the board, and that's how they would communicate with the adults around them to communicate their needs or their wants on the playground. A mid-tech device. In the middle, we have a switch button. This button is a one message communicator. A child with a communication impairment would hit the button and communicate one message. Maybe that message is yes for yes, no questions, or maybe that message is just bathroom so that the person with the communication impairment is able to communicate when they need to go to the bathroom with the people around them. And then on the far right, we have our high-tech devices. In this picture, we see someone using a iPad-based device or tablet-based device that is speech generating. So as the user activates the icons on screen, the device will speak for the user. The person in the screen or in the image is using a mouth stylus to activate these icons instead of using their fingers to activate the icon. And assistive technology matters because it is, or it should be considered as a bridge between where someone is, what their needs are, or the challenges they are facing, and where they want to be. Between the two, we want to think about what is the medium that will get this person from point A to point B. And often it is some form of assistive technology. Assistive technology helps us meet various areas of need, including education, employment, independent living, community participation. And then on this screen, we just have a couple of examples of assistive technology within each area of need. There are additional areas of need, such as mobility, hearing, communication in general, that we could also have put on the screen. But I wanted to focus again on the areas that we're talking about for this presentation. So now we're going to get into education specifically. And what does this look like when we're going through systemic barriers and using assistive technology? So the first thing we want to think about is education rights. What are the rights that students have as they are accessing their education? The big one is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We call it IDEA. It's a multi-part act that does mandate that all children are entitled to a free, appropriate public education tailored to meet their specific needs. The different parts of IDEA are focused on specific age groups. So there's one age group that focuses on the needs for children in the early intervention age range, that's 0 to 3 years old. There's another part that focuses on the 3 to 5 preschool age range. And then there's a third part that focuses on students who are between the ages of 5 to 21. What does each of these specific categories or age ranges of children with disabilities, what do they need to access a free, appropriate public education? Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in any program receiving federal money. That includes public schools. And in the public school setting, sometimes we do see children with disabilities who have what is known as a 504 plan that lists their accommodations to help them access the education environment. And finally, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is here to prohibit discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all public areas of life. Some of the systemic barriers that we may see in the education setting include an inaccessible curriculum. So thinking about how when teachers have worksheets printed out, perhaps the worksheet is small print, but if I have a vision impairment, I might need larger print. And just by having standard print on a worksheet, that makes the curriculum and the activity that we're working on inaccessible for me. Another barrier is an inaccessible environment. So we have wheelchair users. Are the desks in the classroom arranged so that someone who uses a wheelchair can navigate the space, not necessarily easily, but easily for them, um, the way that other students are able to navigate the space? There are sometimes a lack of accommodations, and sometimes this is just because there is not an understanding of the students' needs yet. Sometimes in some of our school districts, we do see obsolete technology. So we just have technology that's really, really old and it might work, but it's not necessarily the best for what this specific student needs at this point in time. There are also communication challenges, and sometimes one of the biggest barriers in education is just low expectations. Sometimes students with disabilities are met with educators who do not expect them to achieve. And when we have this systemic barrier in place, that's probably the hardest one to overcome. We need educators to understand that just because the student has a disability, they can still achieve. We just have to do the work to get them there. And so some of the things that we might put in place as far as assistive technology to overcome those barriers are text-to-speech devices and speech-to-text devices. They sound exactly like what they are. We would use a text-to-speech device for someone who has maybe dyslexia, and it's better for them to hear written material than it is for them to read it. We would use a speech-to-text device for someone maybe with dysgraphia, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But for them to be able to communicate or complete written assignments through words instead of physical writing. Maybe students need digital note takers. It could be that students with auditory processing disorders would benefit from captioning systems. As teachers are presenting their material on PowerPoint, it may be beneficial for them to have captions enabled on their PowerPoint system so that students with auditory processing disorders can read along as the teacher is instructing. And then as an SLP, I always put in AAC, those augmentative and alternative communication devices that can be used by students to communicate with their peers and the adults in the education setting. The benefits of using assistive technology to overcome systemic barriers in education are that it can increase classroom access for the person with the disability, but it further increases participation. And just thinking about not just participation from the student with the disability, but also participation from students without disabilities, because we get more ideas into the discourse. We get more vantage points and perspectives into the discourse, and both sets of students are able to interact with each other and understand the curriculum better from different perspectives. And then we also see increased academic achievement for the student with the disability. One thing we want to keep in mind in the education setting is that we want our learning environments to be accessible. So I have here on the screen a classroom, and this is a great classroom, but I don't necessarily know that it is fully accessible for someone with a mobility disorder, or mobility challenge, I should say. It could be because to the right, maybe there's space for a wheelchair to go in that empty space to the right. Um, but unfortunately, we can't tell just from the picture alone. But we want to have or make sure that we are creating accessible learning environments for all students, not just students who are typically developing. So maybe we want to create, again, accessible documents, including things like large print, or if we have students who use screen readers, making sure that the documents we send them are screen reader enabled. Not all screen readers are able to read PDF documents. And so maybe we avoid sending students PDF documents so that their screen reader can read the document to them and they can access the document the way other students are accessing the document. We did talk about captions, but again, enabling captions on videos and PowerPoints for students with auditory processing disorders, thinking about preferred or preferential seating arrangements. Some students might benefit from sitting closer to the teacher. Some students may benefit from sitting further away from the teacher or further away from their peers for any number of reasons, but we do want to keep preferential seating arrangements in mind so that we can make sure that all students are participating in accessible learning environments. We might want to think about multiple methods of engagement. We know that some students learn visually, others learn through auditory methods, and still others learn best by tactile approaches, being hands-on during an activity to learn concepts. And then finally, we want to think about one-on-one check-ins. This happens a lot in the classroom environment where maybe the large group, the teacher presents the information to the large group, students break off into smaller groups or individual work, and the teacher does check in with them. Hey, how's it going? Just want to make sure you're okay. Is everything going well? Is there anything else I can do for you? And then increased time for completion. This can be something that is beneficial for some students. Again, we see this sometimes with students who have attention deficit disorder. And the reason that increased time for completion is beneficial for them is just that it gives them more time to complete a test, for example. Sometimes they may also benefit from testing in separate environments from the rest of the classroom group. But these are just things that help us keep the environment accessible. This is a brief case study for a student. So we have a student who has dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is a writing impairment. These students typically have a hard time writing their letters. They may write the letters backwards, or they have a hard time formulating a thought and writing it into an organized paragraph. So we have this student with dysgraphia, and right now he's failing his seventh grade English class. He understands, he can read the text, so he understands written text. He has excellent storytelling skills, but he cannot compose a paragraph independently. Once we understand that the student has dysgraphia, we can implement an individualized education plan, otherwise known as an IEP. And in the IEP, perhaps we state in the assistive technology section that this student would benefit from speech to text software. Because the student does have excellent storytelling skills, he could benefit from speaking his essays out and having them transitioned or transformed into text using software. He might also benefit from audiobooks and a digital note taker. The reason the digital note taker is important is because if a student cannot write written text for whatever reason, it's not only English that's impacted. We need to think about classes like history and perhaps science, where the student, if they're not able to take notes, although they are in the classroom and they are learning through auditory information that's presented, how are they able to refer back to that information to study and prepare for tests, quizzes, and final exams? So those are things we want to keep in mind. And the outcome in the most ideal scenario is that the students' comprehension is increased. When students understand that they are getting the information, their confidence also goes up. When students are more confident, their academic performance goes up as well. Transitioning to employment, some employment rights for people with disabilities to keep in mind. These are their rights that they have as they engage with employers. But first is the ADA. Again, it prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all public areas of life. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act does require employers to provide reasonable accommodations to perform essential job functions. And the operative word in there is reasonable. The accommodation cannot be just because the person wants something. The accommodation has to be reasonable. It can't cause undue financial distress to the company. But otherwise, the company is expected to provide accommodations for employees to perform the functions of their job. And then ideally, employees should have a reasonable expectation that the collaborative process between themselves and HR to get accommodations set in place is collaborative and relatively easy, simple. Both parties are working together on a shared outcome. Some systemic barriers we see in employment are the biggest one is probably hiring discrimination. It can be difficult to prove, but again, thinking back to what systemic barriers are and how some people carry just preconceived ideas of someone's ability to perform a job based on a visible disability. They may not offer the job to the person with the disability, but that, sometimes it's hard to prove that because if anyone ever looked into it, they would say, oh, well, this applicant was just more qualified for the role based on this specific job history and these qualifications. But hiring discrimination is a significant systemic barrier that people with disabilities do face. Um, Another one is inaccessible systems based on the workplace. Sometimes the systems of the workplace are just not accessible, and we're not just talking about technological systems, but maybe the communication systems of an environment is not necessarily accessible for all people with different disability or ability statuses. There may be a lack of accommodations, and this can be because the person with a disability does not want their employer to know that they have a disability because it can impact maybe or create advancement obstacles. But a lack of accommodations could also just be because the individual themselves, they know that they have a disability. Maybe the employer knows that they have a disability, but they don't necessarily know how to navigate the system to request a reasonable accommodation to complete their job. Some of the assistive technology that we might see or use to overcome systemic barriers in employment again include text-to-speech devices, speech-to-text devices, digital note takers, captioning systems, maybe a one-handed keyboard. And the benefits of all of these things are increased productivity, increased job retention, and improved workplace experience. Some people think that using assistive technology is only beneficial to the employee, but it is also or can be beneficial to the employer as well because the overall office has increased productivity. We have a more expanded talent pool within our workplace and we reduce turnover costs. So going back to what we were talking about earlier in this presentation, perhaps someone gets into a car accident and now they have a disability, right? Well, instead of the person leaving their job because the job will not provide a reasonable accommodation. The employer gives the employee a reasonable accommodation. The employee then stays on the job, and the employer doesn't have to spend money on advertising the position, interviewing candidates for the position, hiring somebody, onboarding them, training them. So the turnover costs for the employer go down. An employee success case study to share. An administrative assistant recently acquired a viral infection that caused profound sensory neural hearing loss. Profound hearing loss means that the person probably cannot hear either in one ear or both ears. But this person is an administrative assistant, so we can expect that they are taking a lot of phone calls throughout the workday. They go to their HR and they're like, hey, this is what happened. This is what I'm going through now. I need to be able to hear people on the phone, or I have to be able to know what they're saying so that I can meet our clientele's needs and get them directed to the appropriate personnel. And so HR is like, okay, well, we give you a CapTel phone. CapTel phones are what you see pictured on the bottom left, but these are phones that have screens that will caption what the other person is saying so that if I answer the phone, I can see what they're saying and I can read what they're saying and then respond back to them using oral language. The outcome of this case study is that we have a continuity of services because we're not losing our administrative assistant who has been here 10 years. She just has a newly acquired sensory neural hearing loss, but we've adjusted and made an accommodation so that she can continue doing her job. She knows her job. She's been doing it for 10 years. She's great at it. We just have to make an adjustment. Um, but otherwise, the administrative assistant does also experience increased confidence. Okay, I'm still able to do this. I'm still doing really well. And then their job performance does also increase. And finally, housing. Getting into housing, there are some housing rights that people with disabilities can reasonably expect. The first is the Fair Housing Act, prohibiting discrimination in housing related activities, including renting and buying. There is also the reasonable, or people with disabilities can expect reasonable accommodations from perhaps their landlord. So maybe there's an accommodation regarding their communication. If I am someone with a hearing impairment, maybe I ask my landlord, hey, as an accommodation, please do not call me. Please only communicate with me through written messages, whether it's email or text. Even if it's like, we have um, some maintenance that's scheduled in 2 days, please let me know 48 hours in advance. And through written communication, please do not call me because I won't be able to hear you. And then finally, people with disabilities can expect reasonable modifications. Again, the operative word is reasonable, but if they are communicating with their landlord, they may ask for permission to install assistive technology, provided that they restore the unit back to its original condition when they move out. Systemic barriers that people with disabilities face in housing include limited accessible housing stock. So that's probably the biggest one. There's just not a lot of accessible housing. We see sometimes that landlords do discriminate against potential tenants based on their disabilities. We may see a landlord refuse to permit changes to the unit based on the tenant's needs. And then again, there can be communication challenges between a landlord and a tenant across the board, regardless of disability status. But some of the assistive technology that we might use may include mobility technology. So we might use indoor railings or a stair ramp to help someone get into and out of the house using a wheelchair. We might use smart home systems such as an Alexa or Google Nest connected to their thermostat, so that way the person with the disability is able to adjust or make adjustments to the home environment based on their comfortability. A dead man switch is not necessarily a traditional form of assistive technology. We see it a lot used with power tools. And the way that it works is someone puts their foot, or they'll plug in a pedal. It looks like a gas pedal for your car, excuse me. And then what they'll do is they'll plug that in and they'll activate it by putting their foot on the switch, and then they'll use the power tool. It'll activate the power tool if the power tool is plugged into it. The reason it's called a dead man switch is because, if you take your foot off the pedal, the device itself stops, which if you have a saw, that's a really safe thing to happen. So if it falls or you take your foot off the pedal or whatever may happen, the device itself stops. So we can use that as a type of assistive technology. And maybe we use that for some of our kitchen appliances. And then again, indoor railings may be helpful for people with disability or mobility challenges in the home environment. The benefits of these assistive technology devices is that it increases independent living for people with disabilities and it makes their living situation safe. A housing case study, a tenant with both gross motor, so those large movements like walking or moving our arms a lot, and fine motor. So those are smaller movements using moving our hands and our fingers. So someone with both gross motor and fine motor difficulties finds it challenging to complete simple tasks at home independently. And what they do is they request to make reasonable modifications to their home environment. The landlord approves it, and the reasonable modification that they came up with is smart home system. So they have fine motor difficulties. Well, they ask to have a facial recognition lock installed on their front door so that they can get into the house using just their face instead of using the manual key that we use traditionally or using a keypad to enter their home. And then smart thermostats can also be used by people with these specific challenges because it makes it so that, hey, if I can't manually adjust my thermostat myself, well, I can say, Alexa, set the air to 72 degrees. And that works out well for me. The outcome of this is that we do see people with disabilities, increasing their own independence, which does increase their self confidence. It increases their safety as well. And then they're less reliant on caregivers. Your part, you sat through this presentation, and that's so great, but there's more that we can all do to help. One thing we can do to help is take action. So identify barriers, systemic barriers that exist within your organization, your workplace, your community, and think about solutions that you may have or that you can come up with to eliminate those barriers. So, one barrier may be that your workplace does not necessarily have a website that is in accordance with the web content accessibility guidelines. And so maybe you say, we can do something about this. We can change this. We can get this done. And so then you think about what structural changes need to be made or what policy changes may need to be made within your workplace to make it more accessible to people with disabilities. And I know a lot of times some of us are not in management positions. So maybe I am a coordinator or I am middle level management, but regardless, I'm not the person who makes the decisions, but I can be the person who informs the decision makers so that they can take the necessary steps to make adjustments to make our organization, our community more accessible to people with disabilities. And then we can always advocate for people with disabilities as well. We can advocate for funding, or maybe we have plenty of funding, but we're not necessarily using it for people with disabilities. So we advocate for reallocation of resources. We want to support people or support inclusive policies, and then we want to be accessible as individuals. So if I'm in my workplace, I use and create accessible documents for as part of my job. I arrange my furniture so that someone with a mobility challenge can come into my office and navigate this space easily without um, any complexities or any challenge or barriers or obstacles in their way. And what I find is that if I make changes as an individual, then the people around me make changes. It's like when you're outside and you're doing your yard work, maybe you do your yard work early in April, and then all of a sudden you notice five of your neighbors have also done yard work because your yard looks better and they don't want to look like the bad yard. So they'll also step up and do their part. So sometimes it is just being the change you want to see in the world, as they say. And that brings us to our conclusion. We do have a couple of minutes for questions, but just to reiterate everything, systemic barriers, including attitudes and beliefs, they create obstacles that are unnecessary for people with disabilities. But we can use assistive technology to reduce and eliminate those barriers. And accessibility supports education, employment, independent living, civil rights. It may require policy changes and technology implementation, but it does overall support us as a collective, not just people with disabilities, but non-disabled people as well. Everyone has a role in advancing assistive technology, and everyone can benefit from assistive technology. Um, some of us are probably using assistive technology at home and we don't even know it yet. One of the big ones I use with my power tools is the dead man switch, but I also have a KitchenAid mixer. And although it's not necessarily assistive technology for me, it can be considered assistive technology for someone with mobility and fine motor challenges. So I am open to questions. I think, yeah, the next slide is just a couple of resources, but most of my sources were cited throughout the presentation on the slides themselves. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Ming. Thank you so much.
You're very
I
welcome.
There actually is already a question that was posed by Director Goodenow, and I'm not sure if you're able to get off mic, Director Brothman, but if not, I can read it. As a child, I had a transformational experience with the speech pathology special educator. However, at that time, these were only provided out of the classroom in private. As a result of my race, I was atypically identified as being in need. However, those classes became my introduction to allocution, which I had to look up. That means someone who can speak very eloquently with their words, someone
Mhm.
who's a really great communicator. So for anyone else who would have had to look up that word, I had to too. So thank you, Director Goodenow, for that lesson, which ultimately dramatically shaped my life for the better. This example is meant to exemplify the challenges of intersectionality. I was both targeted and inappropriately selected to be removed from my class due to my race. My disability was both the curse used to marginalize me, and my treatment was a resource that altered the course of my life. How do we, as policy professionals here at the PHRC, we enforce anti-discrimination policies and legislations in Pennsylvania? How do we challenge the presented intersectionality, I guess, in this situation of race and disability in the sector of education? How do we do that? Often in these issues, as they're framed as simple binaries, but in the PHRC, this is a keen issue to understand. What models can you recommend to help our staff navigate the harm hierarchy? I also had to look that up, presents to folks with disabilities, and how do we avoid simplistic solutions to these intersections within these sectors of discrimination and these intersections of our lived experiences with
Yeah.
disability.
That is such, first of all, thank you, Director Goodenow, for sharing your experience. But that is such, it's a really complex question that I don't know if I have the answer as one individual. I think PHRC doing the Diversity Speaks series is phenomenal. It's an excellent start. But I think if we want to sort of eliminate some of these biases, because that's what they are, we have to acknowledge our own implicit biases that we have. And I don't know that it's a systemic, that maybe there can be an organizational approach, but I don't know what it would be. I think it's more of individuals. So if I am the person who is hiring, if I come across an applicant who does have a visible disability, am I checking my implicit bias before I reject their application? Thinking back to that intersectionality wheel that we saw in the presentation, what can I do to, or like looking at the intersectionality? So we're looking at the race, we're looking at their ability status, maybe we're looking at their education status, their socioeconomic status, sorry. And we're taking all of this into consideration. What can I do to overcome some of the barriers that they may already be facing? And, honestly, I really don't have a solid answer for you, especially not at the organizational level. But as individuals, there are things that we can do to sort of compete against some of the barriers that these people may be facing. I will
Thank you
say
for being
that,
honest, Ming.
yeah, of
Yeah.
course, of course. I will say that your experience as a child who receives speech services, it is changing now. So we don't do as many pull-out services as we used to do. So we're not pulling students out of their classrooms anymore, which means that they lose time in the education setting. We are doing more push-in services. We're going into their classrooms and providing them services inside of the classroom that are directly applicable to the curriculum that they are learning when we can. It doesn't happen all the time, but when we can, we are providing those services so that we are not further marginalizing our students or further putting them at a further disadvantage as we pull them out of the classroom for their services. So we're seeing changes, but yeah, I don't know how to address it at the organizational level for PHRC.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I think we have I think within the PHRC, I think we are I'm an advocate for us being we are the experts at the PHRC, and I think us being aware of the legislation that we do have, and the awareness of even our own lived experience. Director Goodenow, I think, is even you bringing this up to the forefront, and what you're mentioning too, Ming, is that inclusionary practices within education has definitely been brought up to the forefront within the last, oh man, 15, 20 years, because of the experiences that Director Goodenow has had, and how they've realized that that has not been good experiences for students, with all intersections, no matter what race. They realize it's not good to pull out students. We want to include our students throughout the whole educational experience. So, but thank you for sharing, Director Goodenow. And I think as an organization, we'll continue to do our best work, across the board, when it comes to inclusion. And so, and assistive technology is helping with that. That's really great. Any other questions? I think everyone's able to get off mute if need be, if you want to raise your hand or if you want to put any questions in the chat. I know I have some questions if no one has one. I'm glad you mentioned I know you talked a lot initially within because of your expertise about the kiddos and education. And I'm glad you started talking about housing, because we have a lot of enough of a lot of our complaints are in employment, but housing is definitely a stickler when it comes to even modifications and even accommodations within housing. And it always kind of boils down to, who's going to pay for it. You know,
Yeah.
you know, so are there any particular resources? I know you're in another state, but and I know some of our experts here on the call would know that too. But are there any particular resources or ways, I know you mentioned fundraising, that you're aware of that can assist with our landlords in getting funding for those accommodations that are this may need for the housing?
So I am not entirely sure if they assist landlords, but I do know that Pennsylvania's Assistive Technology Fund or Foundation, they do assist individuals with getting
Gotcha.
either
Yes.
low cost or no interest or low interest loans for
Hmm.
assistive technology. I don't know if they would assist landlords though.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That is attached to the individual who has a disability.
Right.
Hmm. Uh-huh.
Correct.
Okay.
Um,
Makes
I don't
sense.
know. I don't know of any others. Yeah, I can't think of anyone else in Pennsylvania right now
Thank you for that.
for
Yeah, that makes
housing
sense.
specifically.
Because we'll get that sometimes also from, public accommodations. I think I have some help here in the chat.
Yes.
Let me look. Uh,
Oh, yeah.
yep, Pennsylvania System Technology Foundation. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. Yep. They're the experts. Yep, they
They're the
know.
experts.
Perfect. All right. I guess same thing for employment. I'm really as far as AI. I know you mentioned you had the three levels as far as like the lower level, mid level, and the high tech level.
Right.
How do you, I'm always interested, with artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact labor, how that's going to impact everything. But in particular, how do you think with artificial intelligence? We had a really great, our most recent disability conference, and the in AI. How do you think AI will impact, assistive technology in the future? And in what ways do you see that having an impact
So
with
these are
assistive
very good
technology?
questions. But I think, so I'm speculating here because I don't know. But I do think that AI can be very beneficial for our more high-tech assistive technology devices. I I don't, maybe like we can use different kinds of artificial intelligence to create our low tech or no tech assistive technology. But I do think that it will be beneficial for our high tech devices. We are seeing a lot of AI in the field of speech. Um, for SLPs, we're starting, and that's speech language pathologists for those who don't know, but for SLPs, we're starting to see AI document our notes for us. We're starting to see it do not necessarily complete our evaluations, but inform our evaluations a little bit more, collecting those linguistic samples. And then we are also starting to see it a lot in our augmentative and alternative communication devices. And I think I think it can be beneficial. At our last in November, we had our annual ASHA conference, American Speech Language Hearing Association conference, and there were so many topics on AI and where how we as a field can use it to shape the future for people with communication impairments. But yeah, I think it can be beneficial. I try not to be negative, so I try not to think too much about the harm it can also cause. But for the most part, I do think right now, where we stand right now, I think that the benefits of it will outweigh any costs, as far as communication goes. But I can only really only speak to communication right now, not so much our mobility assistive technology.
Okay, great. You also mentioned the web content. As far as guidelines with that, I think that's really interesting because I know I'll go on, certain web places and see ways that you can, you know, increase text and be able to hear things audibly, which you may potentially would be able to, if you had visual impairments. So it's really great. I didn't know that there were actually official guidelines, so that was something new that I learned today. And
Okay.
so I just thank you for being with us, Ming, and also
You're welcome.
for being a resource. You became highly recommended from our staff here, so I think it might have been, I don't want to lie. I think it might have been Director Griffin, who might have recommended you, but I wanted to tell our staff, thank you once again for bringing on another great presenter and another one who's just given great information to us today. So we thank you for being just a great presenter with this information. This is highly, just really great information that's very can be used in a lot of our facets when it comes to the sector of education, employment, public accommodations, and housing. So we thank you for this. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Thank you all. If there are no other questions, I know it's a nice day here in Pittsburgh. I heard that it's a great day in Harrisburg. I'm not sure what's happening in Philly, but I'm going to let you all go to have a great day and happy spring, you all. Thanks again. Thank you so much, Ming. Have a great day,
You're
you
very
all.
welcome. Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.